impacts you and your community. 13 on Your Side Evening Plus starts now.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome into Evening Plus on this Friday evening. I'm Julia Gorman, joined once again by our Lauren Baker as we continue to break down Day 5 of trial in the case of Christopher Schurr. He is the former Grand Rapids police officer accused in the murder of Patrick Loyola after a traffic stop turned into a struggle and ultimately the fatal shooting of Patrick Loyola just about 3 years ago. So today the big thing, Lauren, of course, was we saw Schurr on the stand for hours. That was the bulk of testimony today. We also have our Callie Lichter, Riley Mack, and Josh Albertus all live outside the courthouse for us. But Lauren, I'll start with you. What stood out to you about today?
I think obviously it was Schur's testimony.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. There was definitely a lot of anticipation to see if he would speak. And a huge reminder is that this happened 3 years ago. This is the first time we've heard his side.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting to see if the defense is going to be able to continue those building blocks of their case. And also interesting to see how Becker would respond and what questions he would ask. And, if they would be able to kind of put into the jury's perspective of what case is better or which one they should be leaning towards.
Yeah, it was certainly interesting. And yeah, 3 years is a long time. That certainly came up a couple of times today where it was like, well, do you remember this detail? And, going back and looking at written statements, looking at reports, looking at video. I do want to pull Callie, Riley, Josh back in here. Callie, we can start with you as far as your take on, seeing Schurr on the stand today.
I mean, this was something that was a will he, won't he for, a number of years. And frankly, all of us in the media room were a little bit, I guess not shocked, because it's always a possibility he was going to take the stand. But I guess we weren't anticipated this like this morning at 8:30 a.m. First witness called. I know they went over a quick little, the defense wanted to enter an exhibit, a piece of evidence, and so we thought, oh, they're going to call more witnesses, and then they were like, we would like to call Christopher Schurr to the stand. We were a little bit shocked. But we've heard throughout the past couple of days some of these witnesses talking about a reasonable officer, GRPD officers in general, because they can't speak to what Schurr was feeling. He's the only one who can speak to that, to his emotions, what was going through his head on that day in April of 2022. So I think it was really interesting to see how, especially during, the examination by the defense, they kind of went through every single decision that Schurr made that day and then the justification behind it. And we heard a lot of it's GRPD policy to do this. I was scared and that's why I had to do it, which again is going back to the defense's argument. And again, they're not trying to prove anything. He's innocent until proven guilty. It's on the prosecution to prove that. But the defense is saying, this was self-defense. He was scared. And so you definitely saw that as they kind of went step by step through his testimony about what he did that day.
Callie, yeah, I appreciate that. And I know in our early evening shows, you really focused on the defense side of things. Josh focused more on the prosecution. We do have one clip here, or several clips rather, from testimony. Again, of course, the taser was a huge topic of discussion. And this was brought up many times throughout trial, that Schurr has been tased during training, early on in his career, so he knows what that feels like. It's something many officers do. We have a clip from him, kind of describing that experience.
Now, when you were tased there, did you feel like you had much control over your body?
No.
And we've heard this term, I think, sometimes, taking the ride. Is that what they refer to it as, is when you're under the effects of the taser?
Yes.
How long does that ride last?
5 seconds.
Do you feel during that 5 seconds that you have the ability to defend yourself?
No.
What are you trained that can mean for a police officer in the field if someone fights them for their taser and uses it on them?
They would get access to our firearm.
And this is, of course, the question that we hear over and over again. What led up to that moment where he fired that shot and killed Patrick Loyola? Obviously that's a scenario that is being seen in two very different lights, depending on if it's the defense or the prosecution on the stand. Riley, I want to send it to you now and sort of talking about there were a lot of questions we heard today about, was this intentional, of Schurr being asked, was this intentional? Were you mad at him? We're going to play a clip in a moment, but walk me through some of those questions on the stand today.
Absolutely. The defense had a lot of questions, like you said, for Christopher Schurr, asking, did you know Patrick Lyoya? Were you angry at him? Did you want to harm him? His answer to all of those questions was no. He specifically said that I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. The defense asked, you could have arrested him right when he didn't, respond to your commands when he got out of the car. Why didn't you? And Christopher Schurr said, I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. And then at the end, we had a juror question that was really actually a wonderful question, asking, if Patrick had gotten that taser, if he didn't believe that that threat of the taser was there, could he have shot? Excuse me, I have my notes all mixed up. He specifically said at the end, I remember him saying that he did not want to harm Patrick Lyoya with the taser. He felt that he had to use that deadly force. He simply did not want to get to that level, but he was forced to based on the circumstances.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we heard that several times today. And, a lot was talked about, too. And we heard jury questions on this about, again, of course, the lead up, the involvement of alcohol in this case. And sort of there was quite a bit of focus on the things that happened leading up to, before we even got to the taser and the use of the firearm, things that were concerning to former Officer Sher, just about how the whole scenario was playing out. We've got a clip from here from the defense questioning him on that.
Because what's your normal experience having a struggle like this, where you chase and tackle and deliver some strikes?
My experience with foot pursuits has been typically people run, and if you start to catch up to them, sometimes they might just give up, or you tackle them, they give up. Sometimes, you do have to do a couple knee strikes and then they give up, but not this kind of drawn out altercation, if you will.
So what are you thinking at this point?
I really don't know what I feel like there's something more going on. That's what I'm thinking.
And I don't want to forget about Josh and all of this. Josh, I know that you really focused kind of on the prosecution side of things, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But we once again, I know you're very familiar with the trial, heard this topic of exhaustion brought up, which was something that the defense was really laying into. But we heard Schurr on the stand today really admit to the state that he was in. Josh, can you break that down for us a little bit?
Prosecutors seem to be getting at Kent County, excuse me, I think we're having difficulties. I can hear myself on feedback, so I'm going to try and get through that. But what we were hearing from the prosecutor today was that the justification part of this was really a big part of their argument, and whether or not what we saw in that video, what it showed Schurr doing, was justified or not. So the prosecutor really getting at a lot of these questions as to whether or not Lyoya seemed to make any material, physical suggestions that he was indeed going to go after Schurr if he got free. So you heard basically, I think this is a rough idea of what this exchange was the prosecutor, but the prosecutor saying, you're not saying he bit you. Schurr said, correct. Not saying he headbutted you. Correct. Not saying he did anything but try to get away. And at that point, that's when Schurr said, I wouldn't use that blanket statement, because he was saying something about clenched fists from Lyoya is what he said. And according to their training, that it could be a sign of aggression. So the prosecutor really getting at the justification side, and whether or not there really was any indication that, if Lyoya had gotten a hold of the taser, if he had gotten free, if he was going to do anything other than try to get away. But Sure, as you heard from there, and you heard Callie talk about as well, when the defense asked him, what were you fearful of? Schurr said that he believed Lyoya was going to use the taser against him and that he was going to die. So that Schurr, obviously, he's trying to say, there was a fear there, but the prosecutor really getting at whether or not there was any indication of that, Julia.
Those same words from Schurr when both the defense was questioning him as well as the prosecution, kind of what Josh was just getting at. We have a clip from that moment.
What have you been trained going all the way back to the MCOLS Academy as far as action versus reaction. What have you been trained?
That action beats reaction.
And what does that mean here in that scenario for you?
If I had waited for him to point it at me, it would have been too late.
And what were you fearful of?
That he was going to use it on me and I was going to die.
Now, and you were in a proximity to each other that he could do that to you,
Yes.
with how you've been trained about that device.
Yes.
Under your training, Chris, are you required to wait to be seriously injured or killed before you can resort to deadly force?
No.
So what did you do next?
I shot him.
Why?
I believe that if I hadn't done it at that time, I wasn't going to go home.
Obviously a very powerful moment of testimony today. And Lauren, I know you've been speaking with so many experts throughout the day as we continue to see testimony unfold. I know I was watching between the 12 and 1 o'clock hour, and they really responded, saying that things were kind of going as they expected. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, that's pretty much what they said. They felt that the questioning that Schurr, how Schurr answered questions was smooth. They didn't see him, get overly emotional, fight back when he was confused about a question. And they said that he was very well prepared. He also, you heard him say a statement like that, saying, he didn't know if you'd be here if he didn't make that decision, kind of just playing into the human side of all this.
Right.
So they were not really surprised by that testimony. In fact, they said that was a very good testimony from Sher.
And it certainly was interesting. I know something that struck me, this community has been, unraveling this story for several years, 3 years at this point, but we have not heard from Sher. That was the big focus today, was we're finally getting to see what he's like, what his demeanor is like, what his attitude comes across as. So, this was a big moment for the community as well, those following along, to see, okay, who is this person? And, that can really influence, obviously the jury, but also, the community's kind of perspective of who this person is that, carried out this act.
And the defense actually really set that stage pretty well. One of the first questions the defense asked him is, do you like public speaking? And he said, no, not really. So again, trying to put into perspective for people who are watching that he says he doesn't like public speaking. So you're not going to be seeing an overly emotional person, or, he also is a police officer who has had to go through certain trainings, including this. So you're not going to see someone that's just, overly emotional on the stand. And also too, when he was asked questions that he really didn't understand the answer to, or maybe thought it was a different question, he really wasn't combative towards Becker.
Yeah.
We were really expecting Becker to be very aggressive. He has been very aggressive, and I think to some degree he was a little aggressive, but he wasn't overly aggressive as well. I think in total, even when he got questions from the jurors, his response to the jurors was as if he was just talking to a normal person.
Right.
It was very clear that he was talking to the jurors to help them understand the thought process and to be as forward as possible, which I'm not a legal expert. I can't say if that helps or hurts him, but at the very bare minimum, it does give him that basis saying, I'm a human, this is what happened, and this is how I feel.
And we definitely heard that from him. And, it makes sense what you were saying, too, because he is a police officer. He's been through many stressful, strenuous situations. Many police officers, law enforcement agents are called to testify in cases. I'm not sure exactly what his experience is with that prior to this, but, it would make sense that, maybe he's not the best public speaker, but that under stressful situations, he can respond appropriately and thoughtfully. And so from here, I want to move a little bit more toward the cross-examination. And we saw the defense, and then we saw Becker, and then a redirect, and then a second cross, and then a second redirect. It really was quite a bit of back and forth over that roughly 3 hours of testimony. Josh, I know this is what you really focused on today, was this cross-examination. We've got some clips from testimony, but overall, your response to, seeing Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker, once again, question quite intensely former Officer Schurr.
Well, he was really going back, as I said, over and over to that issue of justification. He kept on asking those kinds of questions, and whether or not that rose to the level of what the jury would consider as a justified use of force. I mean, he even got to the point where he was, asking, he was still questioning Schurr, and he said, simply committing a felony isn't enough for deadly force, right? Schurr said, correct. Ignoring your commands, Schurr's commands, is not a reason to use deadly force. No, he said, the only reason you could use deadly force, Becker said, is when you believe you're going to be killed or seriously injured, right? And Schurr said, correct. And it's in that instance where we get into really the defense side of things, and where Schurr brings himself back in, and where he says, or where he said earlier, he did feel he may have been in danger, he may have died if things had not panned out, had gone differently. And if he had not acted, he said, his training is not to wait and see what would happen should things transpire in a different way. But the prosecutor really hammering in on those kinds of questions over and over and over, trying to get to the justification side of things. And then you heard a few of those questions as well. That wasn't the only point. That was a major point, but it wasn't the only point. You had some questions about, of course, the taser that is central to this case at this point, and, how that factored into things, and even a statement that was given to Michigan State Police by Schurr. They estimated about a few weeks after the incident happened. So, the justification point was really the biggest of what the prosecutor was getting at today, and I think you saw that throughout the few hours that we were, throughout the period of time that we were seeing that cross-examination happen.
No, absolutely, Josh. And I want to rope Callie and Riley in here. Something that I know could come across as confusing, but is the point of obviously having a prosecution and defense, is that when we're hearing them talk about the taser, the way that the taser involvement in this scenario has been discussed is portrayed in very different ways. Did some saying, Lyoya had a hand on the taser, whereas you're hearing from the defense that he had full control of the taser. It's presented in very different lights, and we continue to hear that today with Schurr on the stand. We do have a bite from his testimony that I want to play first, and then reaction from Callie and Riley. We can go to you guys next.
So the only reason he did it is because he grabbed your taser.
No,
He had
because
control of your taser.
I shot him because I believed he was going to use it on me.
Because he had your taser.
Because I
That's the
was
only thing you
afraid that he was going to use it on
But
me.
that's the only thing he did with it. He had possession of it. He never pointed at you.
He started to turn up towards me, and I felt if I didn't respond at that time, I wouldn't be here.
Sure. And he's not here, is he?
No, he's not.
Yeah, Callie, we can start with you. That was an incredibly poignant piece of testimony today. Patrick's not here, is he? And he says, no, he's not. And that was the end of questioning in that moment. Callie, this discussion and the hounding of questions about the taser and how that, according to Schurr, played into his actions. Walk us through some of those details.
Yeah, so like you said, Julia, there isn't a case without both sides, and both sides are going to portray the weapon at the center of this case a little bit differently. And so through all the witnesses that we've heard, and then Schurr himself today on the stand, he said that, he was trained if someone gets a hold of one of his weapons, he needs to do everything he can to get that weapon back and make sure it's not used against him. And then you have the prosecution on the other side trying to prove that a taser is not a deadly force weapon, and Schurr shouldn't have been afraid of the taser in that scenario, or that Lyoya would be able to grab it and use it against him. You even had a close-up, or at least our pool camera in that courtroom, kind of closed in when both Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker and Schurr were handling a model Taser 7, not the one used in the case, that one's in an evidence bag, but one, that's been handled throughout the case, about the positioning of where that taser was near Lyoya when Schurr was on top of him, kind of in those final moments before the trigger was pulled. And so you had, different views of even how that taser was held in the moment. Schurr thought it was being held one way, Becker thought it was being held another way. This is both by Lyoya. And so you kind of saw that come to a head. It's about perception. And I kind of wanted to get to, it's a really hard thing. Before this, we've been hearing from witnesses who weren't sure, like in the sense Christopher Schurr. He's the only one who could testify to what happened that day, as I've been saying. And so Becker can't exactly come in and say, oh, you're wrong in what you believe. You were wrong when you said that you feared great bodily harm, injury, death, when it came to this taser, he needs to be very careful and very, law and being in that courtroom, it's all about a system, it's all about logic. So he needs to form a type of a logical, like, oh, if X plus, if X leads to Y, which leads to Z about it. So he can't just come out and say that Schurr is wrong in how he feels and how he perceived that day. He needs to kind of walk through the jury on why he shouldn't have felt that way that day.
Yeah, and that's a scenario that's different from what we've seen so far. Of course, none of the other people on the stand were there in those moments besides Schurr. And we also heard from him today, which I did think was interesting. You just saw some of the video play. There's a chunk of video from that day that we don't necessarily have, the exact perspective that Schurr was talking about. And he brought that up when he was talking about the handling of the taser, that, oh, you can't see what I'm talking about, which is a part of this case. The video that we've all seen, it's not all there, and you can't see in front of them. Riley, I want to toss things to you. We saw again a lot of jury questions today, lots of really thoughtful questions asked, of Schurr to sort of re-explain things. Can you walk us through some of those?
Absolutely. Callie and I have spoke about this at length today of, how poignant some of those jury questions are. And Callie said earlier, it really speaks to how much the jury is paying attention in this case. A juror today asked a question about, Lyoya's inebriation level and whether Schurr noticed that, if he smelled alcohol on him, if he noticed at any point during or after that struggle, realized that he may have been drunk by law. And Schurr testified to that. He said, no, I did not know. He said, looking back at his actions, I probably could have seen that in his actions, but at the time I did not know. So they're really trying to, they're really focusing on all the different aspects of this case, and putting it into that decision, which is a really promising thing for, that the jury is paying attention in this case and they'll come to their decision.
I wanted to hop back in there for a second, Riley. The reason why I thought that jury question, they're really paying attention is because the whole entire point of this case, or like one of the biggest points, is that the prosecution needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was basically something else that Schurr could have done. He shouldn't have resorted to this use of deadly force. And so we've heard from witnesses in the past couple of days that if an officer believes a subject is intoxicated, that certain things like pepper spray or OC spray and other tactics will not work on a person who has a level of intoxication like it would someone who's sober. And so, through these jury questions, it could possibly be they were kind of recalling back to that moment, the fact that, there was officers who testified if someone is intoxicated, you wouldn't do these things, but Schurr himself did not know in that moment that Lyoya was intoxicated.
And of course, hindsight 2020, so many of these experts called to the stand can, hypothesize about so many different things, but in the moment, it was of course a very different situation. I'm going to cut you guys loose out in the field. I really appreciate your time and thoughtful analysis. And of course, you all will continue to cover trial as it continues into next week. So Callie Lichter, Riley Mack, and Josh Albertus, thank you so much for your time tonight. And Lauren, I want to turn things to you to end here. We heard from Ben Crump this afternoon. This is what you sort of focused on in our early evening newscast. For those who aren't familiar, kind of refresh us on who Ben Crump is and why we heard from him today.
So Ben Crump is an attorney. You saw him kind of blow up after the George Floyd case. He came forward and really represented his family hard. And you've seen that in other cases that happen all across the country. And so when this happened, Crump came in to kind of help Ben Johnson, who is also representing the family, and both of those attorneys are representing the Lyoyas for their civil case. It's a reminder that this is the criminal case. We still have another civil case that could happen. And so essentially, it was a very short press conference, but he spoke for the family right after Schurr's testimony, which some may believe is kind of like their time to respond to what Schurr had to say. And the family's biggest thing is that they still believe that this is an unjustified shooting. He put in perspective, if this was your child, what would you want to happen? You want someone to be held accountable, and also really press hard on people to still watch the video, to see that from their perspective that Lyoya did not attack Schurr. So, and that's something that we've heard for the last 3 years. That's something that Crump and Johnson have really stood strong on, which is the fact that they believe that this is an unjustified shooting and something that has happened in other parts of the country and unfortunately happened here in Grand Rapids.
Yeah, and we have a clip that you shared earlier. We can play that now from Ben Crump.
He should be held accountable. The same thing that would happen if it was your child. What would you want? That's what his family wants. If that was your child, what would you want? That's what this family wants. That's what our community wants. Nothing more, nothing less. If it's your child, what would you seek?
Yeah, and of course, we've heard from him before. We've heard from Ben Johnson. As you've said, this is a separate case, on the civil side compared to the criminal side. I know you spoke with many experts, all week long. Anything else that stood out to you, their opinion-wise from today, from what we saw today?
I think the one interesting thing that one of the experts said today is that, yes, the jury does have to decide whether or not Schurr is guilty of second-degree murder. What I was not aware of is that the judge could also put in voluntary manslaughter, which is below second-degree murder. And so what could happen, I'm not speculating because I'm not a legal expert, but what could happen is that the jury could say, there's clear evidence that he did not commit second-degree murder, therefore he should not be convicted. However, there is clear evidence that someone was shot, someone needs to be held accountable, that person is Schurr, and they would want that charge to be what he's convicted of. And that's a lesser charge. He would spend less time in prison if he was convicted of that. So again, you really don't know how this could play out. You really could end up with no conviction. You could end up with a conviction you didn't think that was going to happen, or you can end up with the conviction that has been proposed by the prosecution. So it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out.
And it was interesting, I know many of us were talking about this in the newsroom today. We saw Schurr testify for so long, and it kind of felt like that was a moment where things might wrap up and we would turn to, a rebuttal case by Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker, and then closing arguments. We were sort of preparing possibly for closing arguments today, and then we saw more experts called to the stand, Dave Blake and Louis Von Kleem, again, talking about police practice, police tactics, psychology, use of force, things that we've dove into quite significantly over the last couple of days. From here, we could continue to see more experts called when court resumes on Monday. We kind of thought one thing was going to happen, and of course, we don't know the answer. There's no magic, there's no fortune telling here on what happens each day.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see to maybe wonder what plan the defense has. Did they feel that having Schurr in the middle would maybe separate some things?
That's
for
something
people?
I was thinking about, yeah.
Do you? We will be talking to experts on Monday because we talked to them right after Schurr was done testifying. So I'm interested to see what legal experts are saying. And I think one thing that you have to remember is that both the defense and prosecution, they're very good attorneys. They're very good at their job, and they don't treat every trial the same. And so what these legal experts have told us is that it's been interesting to see the different, I guess, paths they've been taking. Strategies they've been taking to create this whole case. So it'll be interesting to see. Again, they have 40 people ready to go as terms of witnesses. They're not. I think they're maybe like a quarter away done.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if that's what they decide to do.
If we see, move forward. And something else that we have been kind of sprinkling in as we wrap up here is we have seen steady numbers of supporters showing up outside of the courthouse each day, both in support of Patrick Lyoya, holding signs up that say justice for Patrick, and then also people with, blue American flags really on the police side of things, police families and such showing up on the side of former Officer Schurr. We saw him get out of his vehicle and walk into the courthouse yesterday to claps and cheers, and that's something we've kind of seen steadily. Nothing that has, gotten to any need for police intervention of any kind, but a steady show of support for 5 days of trial this week.
And it's, you know, in some ways not surprising, right? This happened 3 years ago. These people have had time to really settle on this case and think about it and continue their support. So, you know, I personally think I thought there'd be larger crowds, but to see the support be continuous all week long, I don't think that's that surprising.
Yeah. All right. Well, you will pick things back up for us on Monday. You're going to be off this weekend to get
Yes.
some rest. So you won't see Lauren this weekend, but she'll be back on Monday to continue all of our streaming efforts. Thank you so much for joining us here on Evening Plus. Of course, you can get recaps of everything, both web articles, video, streaming breakdowns, all on our website here on 13 Plus, and of course during our regularly scheduled newscast. Thank you so much for joining us, Lauren. Thanks for being here. Have a great weekend, everyone.